Welcome to Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana basketball news and discussion, brought to you by the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Join me live at assemblycall.com every Thursday night and immediately following every IU game for our live IU postgame show. And visit InsideTheHall.com for complete coverage of IU basketball and to join the discussion in the Inside the Hall Premium Forum. On this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink, we break down a busy Wednesday in the world of IU basketball as we got official word on the draft decisions of Al Durham, Justin Smith, and Devontae Green, as well as a number of important players around the Big Ten Conference. And then, of course, Wednesday night was the annual Huber's Winery event. Archie Miller addressed the media. He addressed fans. We break down some of those comments. And then also take a few diversions into talking about the offense and kind of projecting some players forward for next season. So all of that coming on this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink. Here we go. All right, Alex. Well, it has been a slow couple of weeks in terms of news for the IU basketball program, but today, Wednesday, as we record this, we got a flurry of it as we got the official word that Indiana's three players, not named Romeo Langford, who submitted their name for the NBA draft and still had eligibility, will be coming back. Devontae Green, Justin Smith, and Al Durham, as well as some reports of some Big Ten guys, which we're going to get to here in just a minute. And then, of course, the Huber's Winery event, which you were at, just drove home from. And so we'll talk about that as well. So those are the two topics that we want to hit up here. Let's start with the NBA draft decisions. No surprise, really, I don't think, that Justin, Devontae, and Al are all coming back. I think most people assumed when they put their names in that it was to get feedback, but that they would be back. So I assume that you are not surprised by that. And obviously, it's very important for Indiana to get all of those three guys back, especially as you start looking at some of the other really good players that announced they're coming back next year.
Yeah, I wasn't surprised on any of them, as you mentioned. The one... It was tricky tonight at the Huber's event. There was a ton of media there, so I think most of us only got in about one question. I actually had the first question, so I asked Archie about the three guys coming back and what they got out of the process and whether or not they worked out for any teams. And Archie didn't say this specifically, but it doesn't sound like any of them actually went through like team workouts. It was more entering the draft in order to get feedback from the advisory committee, which it's kind of the first step in that process. So yeah, with all three of those guys, I noticed you've tweeted a couple of things about this, Jerod. I think there's kind of a misunderstanding among some fans of what the process actually is and what it isn't. And I think the confusion comes with it. Now that you can hire an agent and you can anyone can really declare, it's a kind of a risk-free thing. People maybe sometimes confuse that with, well, this guy actually wants to leave. No, it's really just kind of a smart, decision on these guys' part to get that feedback. I equate it to like a college student. If you were going to go be an accountant, you would, get advice from people that work in the professional field, and maybe you go do an internship, things like that. So, really a good decision, I thought, overall, but from anybody that wants to test the process to get that feedback. But no surprise that those three guys are returning. I don't think there was any chance that they were going to get drafted.
I'm starting to think that calling it like entering the draft or putting your name in the draft is a misnomer that does nobody any favors, because they didn't really put their names in the draft. They did it so they could get the feedback, and it was kind of a formality. It's almost like they should just have a process for guys to get this feedback without going through the whole charade of, I'm entering my name in the NBA draft, and then all the misconceptions that brings. I mean, because, people who follow this stuff kind of understand what that actually means. It doesn't mean that any of the three of them feel like they could play in the NBA tomorrow, which I feel like is how some people take it. So it might, I guess, just alleviate some confusion if they just called it something else.
Well, I mean, I guess the reason they have like the actual quote unquote process in place is so that, they're not having to give feedback to 1,000 guys instead of 200 or whatever. So, but basically, if you're interested in feedback, hey, put your name in, and then we'll we have kind of this process in place that will give you feedback. But, I don't think it ever got to anything more than that. It wasn't like these guys were touring the country, working out for NBA teams. It sounds like some of them have been at home for a couple weeks and then back in Bloomington working out and things like that. So it doesn't sound like it ever really got serious. But, I think the longer kind of it goes on until there's like an official announcement that they're coming back, some fans can get confused and think, hey, why are they dragging this out? Are they really thinking about leaving? No, it's just, it's a formality that they were all three coming back, and just kind of like it was a formality that Romeo Langford was going to keep his name in the draft.
Mm-hmm. So looking around the conference, some of the other big decisions, all the Michigan guys kept their name in the draft as expected. The deadline, by the way, Wednesday night. Among the key returners, Caleb Wesson is going back to Ohio State. Lamar Stevens is going back to Penn State. Joe Wieskamp is going back to Iowa. I think most of those were expected. Stevens maybe kind of the biggest question mark among those guys. Anthony Cowan is going back to Maryland, which obviously is going to make them, a prime competitor with Michigan State next year in the conference. And then in terms of guys leaving, Amir Coffey is leaving. And now I'm blanking. Who are some of the other guys?
Tyler
Cook. Yep.
Obviously Romeo, Nick Ward,
yeah.
Out of all those guys, I think the biggest one coming back, at least in terms of having an impact on a team's ceiling for next season, is Caleb Wesson with Ohio State. Yeah. Because with what's happened with Michigan, with John Beilein leaving and the three guys staying in, behind Michigan State, I'm kind of looking at Ohio State as a team that can potentially, challenge near the top of the conference. Obviously, Amir Coffey leaving, I think, really hurts Minnesota. Not only are they losing Jordan Murphy, to lose Amir Coffey, who has been in and out of their lineup, obviously, over the years with injuries, but he's been a guy that I've always looked at in terms of talent. He's a top 10, 15 player in the Big Ten. Yeah. For him to leave. And then, obviously, Iowa with Tyler Cook, that's a pretty significant loss for them. When you also consider the fact that Isaiah Moss transferred and Jordan Bohannon may miss next season altogether with the surgery they had recently, it kind of feels like in many ways the Big Ten is going to take a step back next year, which might not be a bad thing for Indiana as it tries to kind of move up the ladder in the conference and get back to being an NCAA tournament team.
We say that. It's interesting looking at Bart Torvik's projections for next season because he's already posted some of these. And you mentioned how important Caleb Wesson coming back is. He's got Ohio State 18th in these projections. I say he. I mean, it's his system that has them rated here. Penn State is 22nd in his preseason projections. They're obviously a team that was terrible early in the season but really came on late. And so, I don't know if any of us really expect Penn State to be a top 25 team. It's kind of one of those things like, prove it before we're actually going to believe it. But I think Lamar Stevens coming back is important for them. I mean, he's going to be a senior now, obviously the focal point of their team. So maybe not as important and consequential as Wesson, but that certainly makes Penn State just a much tougher out on a game-in, game-out basis in Big Ten play, having a senior like Stevens there.
Yeah, absolutely. But my question about Penn State is they've got obviously Stevens coming back, but they not only they lose Josh Reeves, they also lost Rasir Bolton, who transferred and I think is going to Iowa State. So I'm looking here at Bart's rankings here as we talk in real time. It looks like he's got Michigan State obviously at the top of the league, then Purdue
fourth, yeah.
Which I'm not sure I'm buying that either.
I'm not sold on that, but I guess
Maryland at 12, Illinois at 16. Illinois is a team that's pretty interesting to me. I think going into next year, if they got two of the better guards in the conference, and they obviously have their big man who was a freshman last year coming back. So the not so good thing for Indiana here is they're 55th in Bart's rankings, and Rutgers is 51st. So
is that with Eugene Omoruyi or without him? Because I think he announced he's transferring, didn't he?
That's without him.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's so let me ask you this, and this will help transition us to Huber's. A couple years ago, when Archie was hired with Brad Underwood and Chris Holtmann, all three of those guys were hired at the same time. If I had told you that heading into the third season, we'd be looking at preseason projections and both Illinois and Ohio State would be preseason top 25s, and Indiana would be in the 50s, kind of going into Archie's third Hubers event, what would you have said? And I guess, what do you say now? How much is that telling at all of kind of where things are? Or are these just some preseason projections that should be taken with a grain of salt and don't mean a whole lot?
Yeah, I mean, I look at it more as something of a tool to kind of give us a reference point of where to start for next season, but I don't look at it as anything that that's set in stone in terms of what kind of team IU is going to have next year. I feel like a lot's going to have to go right for Indiana to make the tournament next year, but I don't feel like it's impossible, or I definitely don't feel like, hey, since they're kind of one of the lower ranked Big Ten teams, that the season is doomed going in, because I feel like since everything went wrong basically last year for Indiana, it almost feels like they're due to have some things go right. The shooting improve, not as many injuries, and I think anytime you look at a team or a program, even though they lost some of obviously their two most talented players, but a new season, I think, brings a different chemistry, a different mix of guys, and how a team is built and formed. That's one thing Archie talked about quite a bit at Hubers was, just kind of improving the chemistry and the locker room. Not to say that anything was wrong last year, but I think that they realized that they need to have more synergy between the players. And the other thing he talked a lot about was being able to protect home court. I think that's something that Indiana has definitely got away from the last couple of years, that really needs to come back and become a strength for this program. But, I think there's a lot of potential upside with this team. Now, a lot of things are going to have to go right, obviously, with Jerome Hunter. Can Deron Davis stay healthy? What kind of impact can Joey Brunk and Trayce Jackson Davis make? Can Armand Franklin come in immediately and provide some shooting from the perimeter? But, I think if, I just mentioned 4 or 5 different factors there. I think if 80% of those go right, then I think Indiana is going to be actually an improved team year over year. Now, if they have kind of some bad luck once again, you could be looking at a 4th straight year of missing the NCAA tournament, which I think a lot of us that follow the program on a day-to-day basis just want to see at least a product that's getting to the part of the season that's most relevant, and not worrying about whether actually Indiana is going to make the tournament, being more concerned about where they're going to be seated or where they're actually going to go when the field's announced.
So when I logged on tonight to see what was said at Hubers, to kind of see the reaction, the very first thought on my mind was, what did Archie say about Jerome Hunter? Did he get asked about Jerome Hunter? Were there any comments about Jerome Hunter? I'm probably not alone in that, because I think it's one of the biggest questions that IU fans have, and one of the biggest question marks about next year's team is, what will Jerome Hunter's availability be? And, it's just been so up in the air. We haven't really heard anything. It did seem like Archie addressed it, and I only saw I haven't watched the full video, so I only saw kind of the printed out quotes. It didn't sound that optimistic to me, but you were there. Can you kind of give us the report on what Archie said about Jerome and kind of how he sounded saying it?
Yeah, I didn't think that it didn't sound like all hope was lost or anything like that. It just didn't seem like there was anything.
Definitely not all hope was lost, but I think everybody was waiting. Like, yep, Jerome's ready to go, and maybe just something more definitively positive. I suppose we were all hoping.
Yeah, I'm looking at it. He mentioned at first, he said something about an injury, and then he basically referenced back to a condition. Like we've talked about with him, is it's not your typical basketball injury. If you tear your Achilles, you're out for a year, and there's a kind of a process. But this doesn't, and we haven't been given any specifics on what the actual injury is. But I think when you use the word condition, means it sounds like that something is going to have to be managed on an ongoing basis. And so I think when you're in late May and you're not practicing for real until September, and not playing a game for 5 or 6 more months from now, there's no reason to put any clarity or any definitive answer on the status of a player when you don't know for sure what's going to happen. Now, he didn't rule him out, obviously. He also didn't say like he's for sure going to be playing. My sense is that he has gotten better than where he was obviously back in early October, but it hasn't been enough. There hasn't been enough kind of work done to this point by him on the court for them for the medical guys to say, hey, he's 100%, he can go. And I don't think there's any reason to rush, because when you're talking about something that is kind of beyond the scope of what's a typical basketball injury, and it's something that this person could be dealing with for the rest of their life, you also have to look at, as fans and as media and people that have a vested interest in the team. And, you kind of look at some of these guys as, hey, how are they going to help the team? But you also got to think of life after basketball for Jerome Hunter, and you got to want what's best for him from a health perspective. And so I think they've actually been cautious with his situation, because they realize that this is not something that they've dealt with before, and they want what's best for the kid. And so I think they're going to continue to kind of see this play out over the next couple of months. And when we get into the start of practice, I think we'll have a better idea. But there's really no reason other than our curiosity. We all want to know, but I just don't think there's a definitive answer at this point. And you can go watch the videos. He watched, he mentioned Jerome Hunter not only in the availability, but then he was asked about it when he spoke to the fans. He took like 4 questions from the audience at the end, and one of the questions was about Hunter. And he sounded somewhat optimistic, but definitely not definitive that he would play next year.
2 years ago when Archie had his first appearance at Huber's, there was obviously the excitement of a new coach. Archie had the great line, "I know where New Albany High School is." Last year, this previous season hadn't gone so well, but everybody's basking in the afterglow of Romeo's decision, and there's still a lot of excitement. What was the scene like this year? Obviously coming off a couple of disappointing seasons, it feels like there maybe isn't quite as much momentum on the recruiting trail as it felt like there was at this time last year. Even though I think there's a really good, solid recruiting class coming in, but just the feeling kind of among fans. So what was it like here for Archie's third visit to Huber's?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a positive type of event. I mean, these are the diehard folks that are involved with the varsity club. I mean, there's a really nice meal beforehand. Good food, so people are in a good mood. They've just had a nice meal, and they're seated at tables around the room. And
is that all it takes? Can we just make sure all IU fans are well fed then before games?
Yeah, the most interesting part to me was when Don Fisher got up to, he introduced they had the softball coach, and they had Tom Allen, and then they had Terry Morin, and then they had Archie obviously talk. But when he got up to talk about Archie, he made a couple of points about just kind of this taking time in terms of building the program the way Archie wants to build it. And also he mentioned that Archie hasn't forgotten how to coach like overnight, like some of the things I guess he had heard over the last year from fans and people. He wasn't necessarily pleased with kind of their characterizations of how things have been going. And then Archie, to his credit, when he got up there, he said it, as angry as some fans, and I'm paraphrasing here, as angry as some people might have been with how last season went, that there was no one more pissed off about how it went than him. When he looked in the mirror, he said he doesn't need anyone to give him a talking to. When he gets up in the mirror, looks in the mirror every morning, he gives himself a talking to and knows that, kind of things aren't where they want to be, but or where he wants them to be at this particular time. But it was, I've been going now for 7-8 years, dating back to the Tom Crean years, and every year it's never been a situation where I felt like there was outward hostility from fans at the situation. Even when Crean had some of those rough years, it was still a pretty positive event, and it was no different tonight.
Yeah. What other takeaways did you have from Archie's comments to the media or to the fans in attendance?
He seems really high on Joey Brunk, not just from a basketball perspective, but he talked a lot about him in terms of his personality and his fit in the locker room, and just kind of what he can bring to the team from that perspective. He did mention He was asked a couple questions about the front court rotation and how those guys are all going to fit together. Had some interesting comments about, Trayce and, whether he can play with Jerod and Joey Brunk, and basically indicated that, they've actually, for the first time, he feels like have some real size in the front court going into next season, because, Jawan's been forced to play. Jawan was forced to play out of position the last 2 seasons, really, as the quote unquote center. So, you kind of feel like if Deron Davis is healthy, and you have Brunk also in the mix and Trayce Jackson-Davis, you actually have size as kind of your strength going into next season. So that's interesting. I think he mentioned something like we have legitimate Big Ten size for the first time.
Not to mention Race Thompson, too, a full healthy season from him.
Right. And he talked a little bit about Race. He said a lot of people forget that he's actually a third-year player coming in this year. He might not show in terms of his experience on the court, but, he redshirted his first year, was with the program, and then last year he wanted to get back on the court despite the injury that he had with the concussion early in the year. But in terms of experience, he's actually one of their more seasoned guys. And really the other thing that I took away was just in terms of the scholarships for next year. Like, that's a question that we're all getting, like on social media and the premium forum. I'm sure you get the question all the time, Jerod, from your listeners, what's going to happen with these last 2 spots? I get the sense now that unless something that's essentially season changing for next year pops up, that they're just going to roll with the 11 guys on scholarship. Archie mentioned in his speech, sometimes having less guys is more, in terms of just kind of the team and guys that kind of knowing their role in the program. You don't want, the 12th, 13th guy on the bench. You obviously want everyone to think they have a chance to play, but he mentioned, having maybe the 9th and 10th, 11th guy being able to see the light at into the tunnel in terms of playing time. And, it felt like last year there were some guys, obviously Clifton Moore, Jake Forrester, that maybe didn't have a chance to kind of see kind of what their future was. And so maybe if you have less guys, you have a better mix in terms of just kind of guys knowing their specific role on the team. And he also mentioned by number 4, that's how many guys he says he wants to bring in the class of 2020. So it was interesting to hear him say that too.
That's interesting about the scholarships. It's not terribly surprising, given that that's something he talked about at his very opening press conference, and that's something that he did at Dayton, was known to not always fill the 13 scholarships. And I do agree, that less can be more. And I think a lot of programs across the country have been successful doing that. Just to play devil's advocate, sometimes less is also less. And, like last year, you look at all the injuries that Indiana had, and you look at, heading into this year with 11 scholarship players, one of those scholarship players in Jerome Hunter, as we just talked about, there are major questions about. It's interesting that he would have that kind of confidence just kind of based on last year. You might think there would be a little bit of a reaction to, oh my God, with all those injuries, we've got to make sure that we have enough fresh bodies. But maybe, you brought up an interesting point there. Maybe he looks at it as, we had that situation last year. Clifton and Jake, 2 guys still didn't really see the floor a ton. And, who knows? I mean, maybe, that was hurting their motivation, whatever. So maybe he just looks at it with the type of program he wants to run. Even if there are injuries, I mean, he's going to have a little bit of a shorter bench, and it's just better to have only 11 or 12 guys on scholarship and not that many. So it's interesting, kind of juxtaposing what happened last year and all the injuries and all the times we talked about not having even enough guys to practice. And of course, last year you had a guy in Zach McRoberts who was like a scholarship player but a walk-on, and then going into this year where it's like, holy crap, we have 11 guys on scholarship. We need some health luck next year, or things could get thin really fast.
Yeah, he did mention several times that this is the first time he felt like he's felt like they had some flexibility in terms of roster going into the season. And kind of 2 things come to mind with being like the advantages of having some flexibility in terms of the scholarship numbers. One is, and he kind of made a joke about this, but he was asked, there was, like I said, towards the end, there was, I think, 4 different fans asked a question, and one asked, like, why haven't we gotten a grad transfer? And we need, X, Y, and Z. Of course, he's up there giving his answer, but he said, if somebody comes available, say in August, and we have a couple scholarships, we can just reach our hand out and the guy might fall from the sky and we'll have our hand there. We could just catch him. And that got a good laugh. And the other thing I, kind of thought about was if it comes time, mid-season next year and say a transfer becomes available mid-season, like a sit-out type of transfer, and you don't have you have a scholarship open, you can get involved with a guy like that. And we've seen in the past some examples of that where guys leave, midway through their freshman year, and they want to go somewhere else and become eligible at mid-season the next year. If you have a scholarship open, that could be a valuable tool as well. So I kind of, I can see both sides of it. While I do think next season could be interesting from a shooting perspective, if it doesn't feel like they've really addressed a ton there, I don't necessarily see the value in taking somebody just to take somebody. I mean, we saw that in 2014 with Tom Crean, with Jeremiah April and Tim Priller, and that obviously, in terms of a production standpoint, guys getting on the floor didn't really do anything. So I agree with the more with the approach of, hey, let's, if something makes sense for us, if something we feel like can really kind of put us over the top next season as a team, let's do it, but let's not just take somebody for the sake of it.
I'll state for the record that I agree with the flexibility position. Part of me would kind of like to have maybe a 12th guy, that you could kind of count on heading into the season, but I like having the flexibility. So
I would take a 12th guy if it was a grad transfer that's not going to take the scholarship. I wouldn't take it like
agreed.
I wouldn't take a freshman that's, there's a lot.
Unless you really believed in him. It's got to be a guy that you want to develop for 4 years and believe in, not just, hey, let's just give out a scholarship. I'm glad those days are over. You mentioned the shooting. We've talked about how the outside shooting, the percentages anyway, are almost surely going to get better next year simply because you're not going to have Romeo and Juwan taking so many threes at a low percentage, which, for as fantastic as they were last year, their individual three-point shooting really dragged down the team percentage. And so instead, you're going to have more of those three-pointers being allocated to Devontae and Al and Rob, and, potentially Jerome Hunter if he's playing. And then two other guys who I'll mention here in a minute. Now, obviously, you lose a lot without having Juwan and Romeo. So it's easy to say the three-point shooting will be better. Yes, but the two-point shooting will also, probably not be quite as good without those two guys there. But, as we look to next season, and I know that we all, wanted to see someone else added as a shooter and all of that, and I agree with that. Is it possible that the shooting will be less of a problem than we think? And certainly tell me if this is wishful thinking. But as I mentioned, with Devontae, Al, and Rob getting more shots, you've heard a lot of good things about Armand. It sounded like Archie talked some about Armand, and who knows how many minutes he'll be ready to play as a freshman. But he's certainly a guy whose 3-point shooting has improved. And Demezy Anderson has been a guy who's really easy to overlook because he struggled last year. But this is a guy who was known as a shooter. Will have another year in the program. And should be able to carve out some minutes. So I guess what I'm saying is it feels like we're going to have more minutes being taken by guys who are capable outside shooters this year, which leads me to think that the 3-point shooting will get better, maybe to at least national average type better, which should have a pretty big impact overall on the offense if the front court depth comes through. Again, our 2-point percentage probably won't be as good as it was without Romeo and Juwan there, but it feels like that should spell more balance for the offense in kind of my ideal, this is May and I'm projecting forward world. Do you get that same sense?
Yeah, I would agree with most everything you said. I mean, the big thing to me is not specifically the 3-point shooting in terms of volume. It's being able to get good shots consistently inside the offense. It felt like last season that too many shots were, just kind of Romeo late in the shot clock having to force something up because he didn't have solid options around him, or Juwan having to, post up and create something. I think the big fix that has to happen next year offensively is just a better. I don't know if camaraderie is the word to work, but kind of guys feeling in sync and in flow with each other, because there was too many times last year, and it was either people were complaining that it was Romeo trying to take on three guys by himself, or Romeo was standing in the corner. It wasn't ever like the whole like a well-oiled machine working together at any point really last year. So I feel like this year, the thing I'm going to be watching for is not how many threes necessarily they're making, but are they getting like creating good shots based on the offense that they're running? Because it feels like the teams that take and make a good percentage of 3-pointers, most of it comes from ball movement and proper spacing and guys knowing each other's tendencies. And one thing that I think we forget sometimes about last year's team was there was a lot of new guys coming together to play for the first time. And so I think with what they have coming back, despite what they're losing, I do think you can expect to see guys who just have a better feel for playing with each other. And that's one reason I think you can be a little bit maybe optimistic that this team is going to outperform expectations, because you mentioned, Green, Smith, Durham, Davis, they're all playing together now, for a third straight year. And last year you were trying to fit in, Romeo Langford, who was, hey, this is the best recruit Indiana's had since Eric Gordon. We got to make sure we get him 15 to 20 shots a game. We're bringing in Evan Fitzner from St. Mary's. We're bringing in Rob Finnessy, a new point guard. It was just a lot of new pieces trying to fit together. And this year it feels like, it's mostly everyone that was, three or four to like 9 or 10 on the depth charts coming back. And so you got to hope with an off season of work and guys just kind of forming a little bit better understanding of how they want to play together, that maybe that can lead in to some better synergy, I guess I would say, offensively. So long-winded answer there, but to me, when I'm trying to like look at the positives in terms of what this team could become next year, I think that's the reason to be most optimistic is, they're losing Juwan and Romeo, but look at all the guys that played pretty significant roles last year that are all coming back. We'll see like what the staff's capable of doing in terms of player development this offseason, how many guys can make a big leap forward, and like how comfortable are they all playing together. And if both of those things are, if they're able to develop some guys, we saw Juwan Morgan when Archie came in, he was basically a role player through 2 years, and then he took a huge leap. Is there a guy or two on this roster that can make that leap? And then that could be, to me, a major factor moving forward for next season.
Who would be the one or two guys that you think would be most likely? Not that they will, but if you had to pick one or two guys to be most likely to make that type of a leap, who would you peg?
I think Finnessy could be one. I don't know if it'll be statistically, but I just think he's going to have he played a ton of minutes as a freshman despite his injury, played in a lot of tough key situations. I feel like he's going to grow a lot. And
the offensive continuity and synergy both functioned a lot better when he was not affected by a concussion. It wasn't perfect. Exactly. There were still moments where Indiana struggled, but it was a heck of a lot better when he was right.
I mean, in terms of the other guys, I don't know that I could pinpoint one. I mean, I think there's a chance that Al Durham, Justin Smith, Deron Davis, all those guys could definitely take significant leaps forward. I mean, the one guy I look at and I say there's a lot more, and Ben Ladner is going to listen to this and say, don't make my mistake, Alex, but Justin Smith is, to me, there's just so much potential there and pure talent that if he can have a huge offseason, I think he could be a really good player next year. So we'll see how that all turns out. And that's not to say that I'm not high on Devontae or Al Durham. I think those guys have room for growth as well. And, Race Thompson's another one you mentioned. There's a lot of guys who have been role players, and that's why I think it's important that somebody takes a step forward. But at least there's 4 or 5 options, that where it could potentially happen. And if they are just able to hit on 1 or 2 of those, I think they have a chance to be better than people think going next year.
Any other insights from Hubers that we haven't gotten to?
The food's pretty good.
I've never been there.
Really good food.
Yeah.
Don Fisher was made a joke that it was comfort food, and he likes a good meal like that. And so I think that's going back to what I said earlier. I think that's one reason you have such happy fans, because they give them this nice meal, get them all filled up, then they have a nice little auction before the coaches come up and talk. But it's always a fun event to go to. I joke with some of the other media guys who have to drive down from Indianapolis and Bloomington. It's kind of of a home game for me for once, only having to drive about 25, 30 minutes as opposed to the customary 2-hour trip that I make during the season for games. So, but other than that, I mean, I would encourage everybody to go watch the videos because we've been so deprived. I feel like of news these last couple of months. Not a whole lot going on. This kind of gives you a little bit to digest and dig into here in these slow times during the off season.
Was there anything interesting from the other sports that you caught? I mean, I know you were there focusing on basketball, but anything notable from the other sports that stood out? Because football was represented, baseball, women's basketball. Any others?
The baseball team is actually getting ready to play in the Louisville regional, so they made a pit stop, and the baseball coach, Jeff Mercer, I believe his name is, real young guy, real sharp guy, talked for a little bit. That was pretty cool to see them make a stop there before they head on to Louisville for the regional. Tom Allen, of course, is as passionate as they come. Does not lack for energy. He was interesting to listen to. The softball coach, her name escapes me, but she also, she was great, and I didn't realize. I guess I didn't follow it very closely how much of a turnaround she's orchestrated for that program. She I believe she was at Marshall for a long time before coming to IU. She was interesting to listen to, and obviously Terry Morin, what a great hire that's been. For the IU athletic department, them being able to get to the tournament last year, not just get there, win a game, and feels like they got some pretty good momentum with their program in terms of recruiting. So a lot of things to be excited about there. Obviously, the main thing that I think everyone wants to see step forward is IU basketball, because it's the flagship program of the department. But
we have a hell of an athletic department if we can get the basketball and football programs going. Everything else is doing pretty well.
A lot of good things to be excited about. I'm looking forward to seeing how IU baseball fares this weekend. Should be interesting seeing them play in the Louisville Regional.
Last question before we get out of here. Recruiting. Trey Galloway is on his official visit as we speak.
It wrapped up early Wednesday.
Oh, it did? Okay, so that's right. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. My days get so messed up when it's a holiday week. And then, am I right that Matt Cross is taking an official visit soon, or is that not the case?
This weekend, I believe it is. So,
have you heard anything about Trayce? Are you, I assume with Cross, I mean, he's not from the area, so this is more of a, kind of get to know the campus, see it for the first time. That's not something where we expect any type of quick moving on a commitment, is it?
No, I believe these are both considered junior year official visits, so they could, I believe, still take another official, if they choose to in the fall. So that's kind of key on the timing. I believe that's right. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure that's how that works now. I think you can take like 5 during your junior year and then 5 again during your senior year. So to get those in now, could be a smart development for IU to do that. But it sounds like they're hoping to kind of get the ball rolling with this 2020 class by fall time and get some commitments. It was interesting to me that he mentioned the number 4 in terms of the guys they want to come as a part of this class. So, maybe you get 1 or 2 commitments and all of a sudden you get the ball rolling downhill, and guys start to realize there's not going to be a ton of spots, and that's how you fill the numbers up quick. So I think it just takes one or two, and then that could really come to fruition, the 4-man class, quicker than we all expect.
Well, Alex, thanks for staying up late to record after making the long drive to Huber's, as you just mentioned. We always appreciate it.
Absolutely.
And by the way, I just want to thank everybody for the kind words on last week's episode with Tim Miles. We got a lot of feedback on that one, a lot of positive feedback, not because of anything we did, but because Tim Miles was a great guest, very engaging, great storyteller. So our thanks
Can we
again
get him
to
on again
him
next week?
I mean, if he just wants to co-host the podcast, all season long, if he doesn't find anything else, I think we would have him.
Absolutely.
He's probably got more stories in there. Oh, Isaiah Roby. That's one we forgot. He's going pro. Speaking of Nebraska.
Yeah.
He's staying in the draft.
I think we all expected that, right? Because Nebraska's brought in, 9 or 10 guys? That's been the hardest one. I'm maintaining that list of the Big Ten offseason attrition. And actually, I thought I was going to have a break now from doing that. And, Rutgers has lost their best player last night at midnight to a transfer. So it's becoming
That's weird. Did you get any insight on that story? Why he just...
I did not.
That's strange.
It's interesting, but it's the world we're living in. I saw tonight that first within 20 minutes it was Quentin Grimes is withdrawn from the draft.
Dotson,
and then
he's coming back.
No, Quentin Grimes withdrew from the draft and now he's transferring. So
Grimes is transferring?
Yes.
Gee whiz. All right. I got to get caught up here. College basketball,
free agency, man.
Yeah, it really is. Well, hey, we got a couple of scholarships, right?
Absolutely.
Archie and Quentin were friends. Put in a good word, and maybe you can come on down to Bloomington.
Archie. You mean Archie and? I'm
sorry, Romeo and Quentin were friends. Yeah. Put in a good word and come on down to Bloomington.
Hey, when you have roster flexibility, you can take on a transfer, right?
That's right. That is the idea. All right. Well, thank you everybody for listening. Thank you, Alex, and we will talk to you guys next week on another brand new episode of Podcast on the Brink. Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. Remember to join me and my co-hosts for more IU basketball talk at assemblycall.com and visit Alex over at insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana basketball. If you want to support Podcast on the Brink, here is the single best way to do it. Tell anyone you know who loves IU hoops about us and suggest that they subscribe. Podcast on the Brink can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Tell your social media followers, email your friends, text your family members. For weekly discussion about IU basketball, they need to be subscribed to Podcast on the Brink. We'll talk to you next time. Go Hoosiers.